Angular has been improving and shipping a ton of new features recently, and even if you do use it every day at your work, I'm pretty sure you might have missed at least a couple of these, because I definitely did. And as you know, the whole trend in the front-end framework space has been server-side rendering within the last couple of years, and Angular doesn't only do that, but they also do hybrid rendering. Now let's take a look at the code, and I'm going to explain what that means. But before I do that, I actually want to proudly mention that this video is indeed sponsored by the team behind Angular. So thank you guys for that, and shout out to all of you. So what is hybrid rendering? As you know, we can have different pages, different routes. And with hybrid rendering, you can select how each page is going to be rendered. So for example, we can define some of these as client, as we did here, meaning these are client-side applications. So they are the most interactive ones. And this is why these are going to be bootstrapped within the browser. Now, some of them are pre-rendered, meaning these are statically generated sites. So they're perfect for SEO and they can be cached perfectly. And one of them is at least server-side rendered, which is something between those. Now, I did a little bit of sketching here to demonstrate what all of these means, because if you're new to this, you might have been little bit confused lately, and I'm also gonna touch the point of hydration, which is, I think, the most interesting part. So client-side rendering, pretty much the old, good client-side apps that every modern framework has been doing. The browser fetches the HTML and the JS bundles here, and we're bootstrapping the whole application at once. Perfect for admin apps, dashboards, everything that's not out there in the internet, because even if search engines claim that they are good at parsing JavaScript web applications, they still don't, even 20 years later. Now, what is static site generation or pre-rendering, as we saw in some of our routes, where this is perfect for webs or web pages that have a lot of SEO text. And this is going to be working the following way. So the build system, while the application is building, is going to generate these pages, and we're going to be deploying them on a CDN or a server. Now, these servers are simply going to be serving these pages. And since these pages are not interactive, the browser simply renders it. As simple as that. Now, server-side rendering is something in between. So our server-side rendering is going to send us an HTML back. And this HTML is already a rendered Angular app, right? But it still has to download the JavaScript bundles. And the app is still not fully interactive, because these JavaScript bundles have not initialized. So the app doesn't let the user interact with all of these JavaScript related parts. Now, we do download these JavaScript bundles, and unfortunately the app has to re-render, because the first time we received an HTML, or actually it was here, the user already sees something, but now that the JavaScript part arrives, the app has to be re-rendered, and this is actually where the flickering might happen, depending on how big your application is, or how slow your network is. And now the application is actually fully interactive. Now, in contrast, we have server-side rendering with hydration. And I'm going to talk about hydration in a minute. So what is hydration? Pretty much the same thing, but the HTML that the server is sending back is hydrated. What do I mean by hydrated? Well, it knows that it doesn't have to re-render the app completely here. And as you're going to see, that we still need to download those JS bundles. But now, when we download those JS bundles actually hydrate our app, meaning it reuses the server-generated DOM, and it doesn't re-render the app from scratch, so there's no flickering. And it slowly makes our app fully interactable by first attaching the event listeners, and also restoring the component state if there is any component state. Now, if we go back to the code, we're going to see that we actually have a demo with hydration. And what hydration does is it gives us some kind of hooks. Now, let me explain what these hooks are. So if we go to Angular's documentation, we're going to see hydration. And we're going to see that we also have incremental hydration. Incremental hydration is pretty much the next step of hydration, where you can choose which parts of your application can be hydrated asynchronously, meaning at some later point. This obviously going to make your JS bundles even smaller because you're going to be fetching only those JS bundles that are needed for a specific part of the application. So these incremental hydrated parts are going to be working with some kind of triggers that are used together with @defer. Now, if we look at our HTML, and this is an example app that you can actually grab from my GitHub page. It's going to be linked below, but this is pretty much a simple application which has some client-side rendered app, pre-rendered and server-side rendered, and some of the features that I'm trying to demonstrate here. So hydration is basically the fact that as we scroll down, you're going to see that these parts are appearing asynchronously on demand. Why? Because hydration lets us use this defer attribute, as I said. So we're going to see that we have defer, and it says on viewport. As soon as the viewport reaches this particular part of the app, we're going to be loading this part of the application, which is a component called app_lazy, and it's basically a placeholder. It's a lazy component here. Now, how exactly can you use this defer attribute? If we go back to the documentation, you're going to see that you can actually define defer on different levels. For example, you can hydrate it on, you can choose to hydrate it when or even never, and on can select many parameters, for example, on idle, on viewport, as we did, on interaction, on hover, and you pretty much get the idea. Another cool thing is that the new versions of Angular are pretty much built with AI in mind. Now, what does it mean? If you go through the documentation of Angular, you're going to notice that they actually did put a lot of effort into facilitating the interaction of a user or a developer with all the AI systems that are available to us at the moment. So for example, they are telling you that you can define instructions for the AI that you're using. And this AI is going to be reading this file called instructions.md, where you can define some standards, some coding guidelines that AI has to take into account whenever it's suggesting you some code or writing code for you. For example, you can tell it that keep HTML and SCSS files separately from TypeScript files, and all the things that you can define this way. Now, another thing is that it also gives us some design patterns. For example, if you're building a GPT or ChatGPT-like app, Angular gives you a very easy way of using resources and using signals to be able to stream this kind of data back and forth and append it as the information is coming back. And you're going to be doing that with a resource. And there's a really good documentation on how to use resources with these param and loader parameters and functions, and basically how to build this kind of AI apps. Now, my application is partly an AI application because I even have a demo with a Gemini API, and I'm connecting to the Gemini API through my service here. And if I open it, source, app, service, you're going to see that I'm actually interacting with it. And you can download this code again, as I said, and play around and see what you can do here. Now, another cool point is that Angular even has an MCP server now. So you can let your AI assistant actually connect to the Angular CLI and make all the AI suggestions that your AI assistant is going to do even in a much easier way, and you can define it in your IDE of choice. Now, since we briefly mentioned the signals, as you know, a lot of components nowadays are written using signals. Angular has been relying on RxJS for way too long, in my opinion. And as you know, if you're using RxJS, it pretty much means that you need to first learn JavaScript, then you need to learn the actual framework, which is Angular, and now you also need to learn RxJS, which is another layer of abstraction on top of the framework. And not to say that you cannot or should not be using RxJS anymore. You can actually use RxJS and a lot of operators that are available to us still, but Angular made our life easier and lowered the entry barrier for new developers by simply giving us a way to use signals and make the information flow through the app with those signals. And of course, we have computed signals as well, on linked signals as well. So this makes our life much easier when working with data and asynchronity. Now, with that said, the Angular version 21, which actually has been released just a couple of days ago, has a support for signal forms, meaning every time you declare a form within Angular, let's take a look at our form. We have a form group, and now every form control is going to have this attribute called field, we're going to be using signal forms, and this is how we create a signal form. Now, is it nice? Of course it is, because now forms are also relying on signals natively. How cool is that? Another feature that made me like Angular even more in the recent times is the control flow. So what is control flow? As you remember, Angular has been relying on some specific directives when it comes to showing the information in the HTML or iterating through the information, for example, with ngIf or ngFor. And now you can simply use these kind of control flow syntax where you say if this or else that, and for loops are pretty much looking like this. Of course, it's a syntactic sugar, but it makes Angular stand in comparison to other modern front-end frameworks, because I'm pretty sure if you never use Angular, if you're relying on some other framework, your framework does not handle HTML this nicely. Actually, let me down in the comments if it does. I'm still curious. Now, I know that this is not new, but it has been enhanced a lot, which is the Angular extension. Angular extension looks quite different now compared to 3-4 years ago, because now we can also not only debug the components, and now the information is presented in a much nicer way. We can see the injected services here, we can see the inputs and all the properties, but we also have a really nice profiler here, which did not really exist before. And now if I profile something, I can see all the changes that happened within the specific click or the interaction that I just performed. And of course, you can have the injection tree, pretty much all the neat stuff that I think every modern front-end framework should be able to do. Not only that, but Angular is also doubling down on accessibility. Now with Angular version 21, we have a native support for Angular Aria components, which means that if we install this package called Angular/Aria, we're going to have access to the following components from the package. And we can build this kind of stuff in a very accessible manner. What does it mean? Well, it means obviously you don't have to use this every time. If you have a use case where you don't have this sophisticated components such as grid, listbox, multi-selects, if you're simply using buttons, HTML natively supports them. But if you're having accordions or combo boxes or tabs or toolbars, Angular makes your life much easier when it comes to accessibility. And of course, last but not least, security. Angular has been having security as a top priority pretty much since the inception of the framework. Angular has a really nice guide on the security best practices, on sanitization, pretty much on content security policy. You just need to go through it and you will see that Angular is handling a lot of things out of the box. Now, if you enjoyed this video or if you have anything to share with me, let me know in the comments below. I'm definitely gonna read it. And thank you for watching, guys. I'm gonna see you in the next one.